We had spent years cataloging the skeletal remains of Chicago's industrial past before Iowa called to us. Word had reached our circles of a town named Buckhorn, a place swallowed by the middle of nowhere. Once a prosperous hub for dairy production, the town withered when its massive creamery finally shuttered its doors. By the time we arrived in early November, the sky had turned into a suffocating shroud of gray. The town was a graveyard of timber and stone, whispering with a wind that felt far too cold for the season. We stepped into the old schoolhouse, our boots crunching on glass and the rot of a century. In one of the sagging classrooms, the word danger was scrawled across the chalkboard in aggressive white strokes. At first, we laughed it off as the work of some bored teenager trying to scare off fellow explorers. But I noticed my friend Tommy wasn't laughing, his eyes fixed on the dust as if counting the particles. He seemed trapped in a daze, barely reacting when Mike playfully tried to wipe grime on his sleeve. We moved to the general store, where cans of forgotten brands sat like relics on the collapsing shelves. Suddenly, Tommy reached for his face, and a thick torrent of dark blood began to pour from his nose. When we tried to help, he snarled at us, his voice filled with a sudden, uncharacteristic venom. I wandered toward the sheriff's office to clear my head, only to find a warning that chilled my marrow. Painted in jagged black letters were the words, "If you bleed, leave Buckhorn and never return." I ran back to the others, desperate to leave, but Tommy had descended into a screaming fit of rage. It took all of us to drag him back to the van as he fought us with a strength that didn't feel human. By the time we hit the highway, he had slumped against the window, pale as a corpse and barely breathing. Back home, we found no records of toxic spills or chemical leaks that could explain his sudden affliction. The warning remains etched in my mind, a terrifying testament that some places don't just house ghosts, they change you. If you ever hear the name Buckhorn whispered as a destination, turn your back and never look back. Tommy eventually recovered, but the spark of the explorer we once knew had been permanently extinguished. We searched for the reason why only he was targeted by the town's unseen malice. The town's history was a blank slate, scrubbed clean of any mention of why people truly fled. Every lead ended in a dead end, leaving us with more questions than we could ever hope to answer. We realized that some secrets are buried for a reason, and we had come far too close to unearthing them. The urban explorer's creed is to take only pictures and leave only footprints, but Buckhorn took something from us. It took our sense of security and replaced it with a permanent, low-humming dread. I began to write down everything, hoping that putting it on paper would exorcise the memories. But the images of the blood and the chalkboard were burned into my retinas. Was it a curse, or was it a biological remnant of a town that died too quickly? Even now, I find myself checking my own nose for blood every time I feel a chill. Our crew disbanded shortly after, the weight of that day breaking the bond we once had. Mike sold the van, claiming he could never get the smell of Buckhorn's dust out of the upholstery. Some places aren't just empty, they are hungry for the life that dares to enter them. The wind in Buckhorn didn't just whistle, it seemed to speak in a language I couldn't understand. Local legends from neighboring towns spoke of the red autumn when the creamery workers first fell ill. They described symptoms that mirrored Tommy's, a slow descent into madness accompanied by physical decay. We had walked right into the heart of a dormant plague, and we were lucky to escape with our lives. To this day, I wonder if Tommy really brought back a piece of that town inside of him. We left the sagging schoolhouse behind, but the air in Buckhorn felt thicker and more oppressive with every step we took. I watched Mike try to lighten the mood, reaching out to flick a layer of ancient dust toward Tommy's sleeve. Instead of his usual laugh, Tommy recoiled with a snarl that sounded more like a cornered animal than our friend. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting toward the empty windows of the general store as if tracking something invisible. We entered the store anyway, our boots crunching on glass and rusted cans from brands that died decades ago. Tommy trailed behind us in a daze, muttering under his breath in a low, rhythmic cadence that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, he lurched forward and clutched his face, let out a wet, gasping sound that stopped us in our tracks. Dark, thick blood began to pour through his fingers, staining his gray gloves a deep, sickening crimson. Mike rushed toward him with a medkit, but Tommy backed away, swinging a wild arm to keep us at a distance. "Get the hell off me," he roared, his voice sounding raspier and deeper than I had ever heard it. I suggested we leave Buckhorn immediately, but the suggestion only seemed to ignite a fresh wave of fury in him. He insisted we hadn't driven 4 hours just to quit over a little blood, but his eyes were wide with a frantic, glazed panic. While Mike tended to him, I wandered toward the old sheriff's office, hoping the walk would settle my racing heart. I stepped inside the reception area and immediately froze at the sight of the jagged black letters on the wall. "If you bleed, leave Buckhorn and never return," the message warned in fresh, dripping spray paint. I ran back to the group, the words echoing in my mind like a death sentence specifically meant for Tommy. I grabbed Tommy by the arm, shouting that we had to go, that the town was literally telling us to flee. Tommy snapped, lunging at me with a scream of, "We're not leaving," that shook the very silence of the ruins. Mike and the others jumped in, wrestling Tommy back as he thrashed and kicked against them. As they pinned him down, his nose began to bleed again, the liquid now almost black and smelling of rot. The fight left him as quickly as it had arrived, leaving him pale, limp, and shivering in the cold November air. We hauled him into the back of the van, locking the doors as if we were being hunted by the very buildings themselves. Mike floored it, the engine roaring as we sped away from the Buckhorn limits and toward the safety of the highway. The drive back was a tomb of silence, broken only by the sound of Tommy's shallow, rattling breaths. He had passed out completely before we even hit the state line, his body leaning heavily against the cold metal wall. When we finally reached his apartment, he woke up in a state of total confusion, not remembering a single moment of his rage. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of that warning in the sheriff's office burned into my retinas. I began digging into the history of the Buckhorn Creamery, looking for any mention of the rising costs we'd heard about. The official records were suspiciously vague, never explaining why a thriving business would vanish practically overnight. I found a single forum post from a former resident that mentioned a sickness in the soil before the thread was deleted. Was it a chemical spill, or was there something much older and more malevolent buried beneath those Iowa fields? Tommy's mother called the next morning, her voice trembling as she described him talking to people who weren't there. She said he was scratching at his skin, claiming he could feel the dust of Buckhorn crawling through his veins. I knew then that we hadn't just visited a ghost town, we had brought a part of its rot back with us. I tried to reach Mike, but his phone went straight to voicemail, leaving me alone with my mounting paranoia. If the town wanted those who bled to stay away, what would it do to the one who had already escaped with its mark? I felt a sudden sharp pain in my own nose and reached up, praying I wouldn't see red on my fingertips. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling my window frame with a sound that mimicked the whispering in the ruins. I checked the news, but the headlines were filled with normal, mundane tragedies that felt worlds away from the truth. That's when I noticed a small, dusty envelope had been slid under my door while I wasn't looking. Inside, there was no letter, only a single Polaroid of Tommy standing in a place I didn't recognize, his face replaced by a void of pure shadow. The sun beat down on the endless straight line of the Utah desert as I pushed westward toward San Francisco. My heart skipped a beat when I glanced at the dashboard and saw the gas needle hovering dangerously close to empty. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding when a rusted sign appeared, promising last chance gas just 5 miles ahead. A cluster of dilapidated buildings slowly materialized on the horizon, clinging to the edge of the highway like a forgotten scab. As I pulled into the gas station, the only sound was the crunch of dry gravel beneath my tires and the distant whistle of the wind. No cars sat at the pumps, and no movement flickered behind the dusty, grime-streaked windows of the station store. I gripped the heavy metal nozzle of the ancient pump, but no matter how I squeezed, the fuel lines remained stubbornly dry. Deciding to find the attendant, I walked toward the store, the silence of the town weighing heavily on my shoulders. A small bell above the door chimed with a piercing, lonely ring as I stepped into the dim, musty interior. The shelves were lined with vintage candy wrappers and snack boxes that looked like they belonged in a museum from decades ago. I called out a greeting, but the only response was the hollow echo of my own voice bouncing off the metal walls. My eyes fell on a newspaper resting on the counter, its headline dated June 2001, frozen in time for over 8 years. Behind the counter, a wall calendar remained pinned to that same month, the paper curling and yellowed at the edges. I peered into the back office and saw a coffee mug with a dark, dried ring of mold at the bottom, as if someone had just set it down. A ledger lay open on the desk, the final entry dated the same day as the newspaper, ending mid-sentence with a jagged ink trail. Through the window, I watched a lone swing on the playground across the street move back and forth in a wind I couldn't feel. Driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I stepped back outside to explore the silent houses of Milberg. Most of the front doors were locked tight, their brass handles tarnished and cold to the touch. I found one house with the door slightly ajar, the wood swollen from years of exposure to the elements. Inside, the living room looked as though the inhabitants had simply vanished into thin air while watching television. A paperback book lay face down on the coffee table, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. On the dining table, a glass of what was once juice now held only a crust of black, fuzzy mold. I walked upstairs and found a child's bedroom where colorful plastic blocks were scattered across the floor in a half-finished tower. A sudden realization hit me that I was an intruder in a tomb, wandering through the intimate remains of a lost community. The air suddenly felt too thin, and I backed out of the room, my boots thudding loudly on the hollow stairs. I ran back toward my car, convinced that dozens of invisible eyes were watching me from the dark windows above. I fumbled with my phone, but the screen showed only no service against a backdrop of mocking static on the car radio. I threw the car into gear, decided that running out of gas in the desert was better than staying another second in Milberg. By the time I rolled into a lit-up chevron across the Nevada line, the engine was sputtering on its final drops of fumes. I found the courage to call the local sheriff's office, needing to know if anyone else knew about the town that time forgot. The deputy who answered seemed familiar with the place, calling it Milberg and claiming it had been empty for years. When the deputy sheriff took the line, his tone changed, becoming strangely evasive when I asked why everyone had left. He told me I was welcome to stop by his office if I wanted to talk face to face, but his laugh sounded forced and empty. I didn't stop at the office. Instead, I drove as fast as I could toward the safety of the San Francisco city lights. My friends tried to tell me it was just a failed land development project, but they hadn't seen the half-finished toy towers. They told me to ignore the feeling that an entire town didn't just move away in the middle of a cup of coffee. On my return trip, I made sure my tank was full so I wouldn't have to slow down as I passed the Milberg exit. As the familiar dilapidated buildings blurred past my window, I felt a sudden, freezing chill in the car's cabin. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, waving a slow, rhythmic goodbye. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked back at the empty road, only to realize that the figure hadn't been waving at me, but pointing toward the back seat of my own car. The dusty road to Snowtown stretched out like a dry, cracked rib through the Australian outback. 2 police officers sat in silence as their patrol car crunched over the gravel of the forgotten municipality. They pulled up in front of the old bank, a squat brick building that looked more like a tomb than a financial institution. One officer stepped out, his boots striking the pavement with a hollow, lonely sound. He adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his flashlight as he stared at the rusted front door. The key turned in the lock with a groan of metal that echoed through the empty street. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stagnant dust and something much sharper. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and stacks of rotted ledgers. They followed the hallway deeper into the bowels of the building toward the secure vault. The heavy steel door of the vault was standing slightly ajar, as if waiting for them. As the door swung open, the flashlight beams landed on 6 large blue plastic barrels. One officer reached out to peel back the lid of the nearest drum, his hand trembling slightly. An overpowering, sickly stench filled the small space, forcing the men to gag and recoil. Forensic teams arrived hours later, their white suits stark against the grime of the bank. 8 human corpses were eventually recovered from those 6 plastic drums. The news hit the Australian public like a physical blow, sparking a national state of panic. At the center of the dark web stood a man named Justin Bunting. Bunting had grown up in Queensland, appearing to be a perfectly normal boy until the 3rd grade. A traumatic encounter with an older neighbor left him with a festering, violent hatred. As an adult, Bunting found work in an abattoir where he reportedly relished the daily slaughter. He was intensely charismatic, possessing a unique ability to control and manipulate the disaffected. He gathered a loyal circle who shared his obsession with moral crusades and vigilante justice. The murders began in 1992 with the death of Clinton Douglas Trace over a perceived moral failing. Bunting reportedly beat the young man to death with a shovel right in his own living room. Later, he would boast about his handiwork while watching television reports of missing persons. His motivation soon shifted from twisted ideology to simple, cold-hearted greed. Victims were tortured for their bank details before being discarded like trash in the barrels. One victim, Michael Gardner, was strangled repeatedly as a form of sadistic psychological torture. To fit his body into a barrel, Bunting had to sever the young man's left foot. Bunting even convinced his victims to record voice messages for their families, claiming they were moving away. His control extended to his own friends, including Thomas Trevelyan, who eventually became a victim himself. The group's final victim was David Johnson, lured to the Snowtown Bank under the guise of a business deal. Inside those walls, the unthinkable happened as Bunting and his partner reportedly consumed parts of their victim. The house of cards collapsed when James Vlasakis, the youngest member, finally broke and confessed. Bunting and his accomplice were sentenced to life in prison, forever branded as Australia's most prolific serial killers. But for the town of Snowtown, the name would forever be synonymous with the horrors hidden in the vault. The bank building stands there still, a silent monolith to a malevolence that knows no bounds. As the sun sets over the outback, the shadows of the past seem to lengthen and reach out. Far across the ocean, another isolated location was about to reveal a secret just as chilling. On a lonely island off the coast of Scotland, 3 men were about to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a meal that would never be eaten. To understand the darkness that settled in Snowtown, we must look back to the birth of its primary architect. Justin Bunting was born in 1966, growing up in what appeared to be a stable household in Queensland. However, the trajectory of his life changed forever, following a brutal assault at the age of 8. This childhood trauma planted a seed of profound hatred that would eventually bloom into a lethal ideology. As a young man, Bunting found work at an abattoir where he discovered a disturbing comfort in the machinery of death. He reportedly bragged to co-workers about his proficiency in the factory-style slaughter of animals. By 1991, Bunting moved to the suburbs of Adelaide, where he began to assemble a circle of followers. He possessed an intense charisma that allowed him to exert psychological control over the vulnerable and disaffected. Bunting bonded these men together through a shared vitriolic hatred for those he deemed morally corrupt. What began as recreational outrage slowly transformed into a terrifying, self-styled moral crusade. He convinced his acolytes that they were the chosen instruments of vigilante justice. The group targeted individuals on the fringes of society, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. The first murder occurred in 1992, setting a grisly precedent for the years of violence to follow. Bunting took pleasure in boasting about his handiwork, even watching television reports about his victims with a sense of pride. Over time, his motivations shifted from perceived justice to blatant greed and sadistic control. He began targeting former associates and partners, viewing anyone who questioned him as a liability. Victims were often lured to remote locations where they were subjected to hours of calculated torture. Bunting demanded absolute submission, forcing victims to address him as God or Master during their final moments. He even began recording the sessions on video, creating a horrific archive of his crimes. The bodies were eventually moved to the abandoned bank in Snowtown, stored in plastic barrels to hide the evidence. For years, the silence of the town masked the rot growing within the old bank's walls. Bunting's influence was so complete that his accomplices helped him dispose of their own family members. The group's final victim was David Johnson, lured to the bank under the guise of a business deal. It was here that the depravity reached its peak, with reports of unthinkable acts following the murder. However, the cult-like bond began to fray as the youngest member, James Vlasakis, grew increasingly unstable. A break in the case finally came when Vlasakis confessed his involvement to the police during a separate investigation. His detailed account led investigators directly to the silent blue barrels in the Snowtown vault. The subsequent trial was one of the most expensive and harrowing in Australian history. Bunting and his primary accomplice were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The name Snowtown became forever synonymous with the atrocities, leaving a permanent scar on the community. Yet, as the world moved on from the horrors of the bank, another mystery was brewing in the North Atlantic. Far from the dry deserts of Australia, 3 men were preparing for their shift on the Flannan Isles. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were experienced keepers used to the solitude. Their task was simple: keep the light burning to guide ships through the treacherous waters. But the isolation of Eilean Moor is known to play tricks on the mind of even the most seasoned sailor. On December 15, 1900, the entries in the lighthouse logbook stopped without explanation. Days later, passing ships reported that the Great Light on the Flannan Isles had gone dark. When a relief vessel finally arrived, they found the island eerily deserted. Inside the kitchen, a meal sat untouched on the table as if the men had just stepped away. The clock had stopped, the beds were unmade, and the 3 keepers had vanished as if the sea itself had reached up to claim them. The relief vessel Hesperus cut through the choppy, gray waters of the North Atlantic toward the 7 hunters. As the island of Eilean Moor loomed out of the mist, the crew noticed the absence of the usual welcoming signal. Captain Harvey blew the ship's whistle repeatedly, but the sound was swallowed by the crashing waves and heavy air. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach as the small boat neared the east landing. He scrambled up the steep stone steps, his boots slipping on the wet, moss-covered granite. At the top of the island, the 75-foot lighthouse stood like a silent, white sentinel against the gloom. Moore found the entrance gate and the main door to the living quarters firmly closed. Pushing the door open, he was met not by his friends but by a heavy, stifling silence. He called out the names of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, but only his echo responded. In the kitchen, a meal sat on the table, the food cold and untouched for over a week. A chair lay overturned on its side as if someone had stood up in a great hurry. Moore noticed the kitchen clock had stopped, its pendulum frozen in mid-swing. The beds in the sleeping quarters were unmade, suggesting the men had risen but never returned to rest. Upon inspecting the oilskin rack, he discovered that one set was missing from its hook. This implied that at least one of the keepers had ventured out into the storm without proper protection. Moore felt the weight of the isolation pressing in on him, the silence louder than any storm. He rushed to the logbook, hoping the final entries would explain the impossible. The entries for December 12th described a storm so fierce it had broken the spirit of even the hardiest men. Thomas Marshall had written that James Duckett was very quiet and the tough MacArthur was crying. Yet records from other stations showed no major storms in the area on that date. The final entry on December 15th was a simple, chilling statement. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. Moore signaled the Hesperus, and soon a search party arrived to scour the island's perimeter. They headed toward the west landing where the raw power of the Atlantic was most evident. They found the iron railings at the landing bent out of shape as if twisted by the hands of a giant. A massive stone, weighing more than a ton, had been displaced from its original position high above the waterline. Supplies that had been stored in a crane 70 feet above the sea were scattered and smashed. It seemed as though a wall of water had surged over the island, yet the lighthouse tower remained unscathed. Captain Harvey's report to the Northern Lighthouse Board was filled with grim uncertainty. He stated that the 3 men must have been washed away while trying to secure the gear. But the question remained, why would all 3 leave the light unattended during a storm? Lighthouse regulations strictly forbade leaving the tower unmanned, a rule these veterans knew well. Locals in the Hebrides began to whisper of more sinister, supernatural explanations. They spoke of the phantom of alien Moore and the spirits of the monks who once lived there. Some believed the sea itself was a living entity that had claimed the men for trespassing on its domain. Joseph Moore was left alone on the island to maintain the light, haunted by the ghosts of his colleagues. Every creak of the stairs and moan of the wind felt like a footstep or a voice in the dark. No bodies were ever found, no debris washed ashore to provide closure to the families. The mystery of the Flannan Isles became a permanent scar on the history of the Northern Lighthouse Board. To this day, the lighthouse remains a lonely, automated sentinel guarding a secret it will never tell. But as the last searchers left the island, one of them noticed something the others had missed, a small, fresh set of footprints leading into the sea. The fresh footprints leading into the surf remained the final, chilling signature of the Flannan Isles mystery. Official reports from the Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that a singular, massive wave was the most likely culprit. They pointed to the bent iron railings at the west landing as proof of the ocean's terrifying power. Yet the official logs recorded no major storms in the area during the precise time the men vanished. This discrepancy gave rise to darker whispers of human fragility and sudden explosive madness. Donald MacArthur was known for a volatile temper that might have been ignited by weeks of isolation. Some believe a simple disagreement escalated into a fatal struggle atop the slippery cliffs. But the lighthouse interior showed no signs of a fight, only the frozen stillness of a life interrupted. Folk legends offer a more ethereal explanation, speaking of phantom birds and ancient spirits guarding the isles. Local sailors still claim the islands are a place where the veil between worlds is thin. Each theory, whether scientific or spectral, fails to fully fill the void left by the 3 keepers. James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur have become part of the island's enduring silence. Their disappearance serves as the final chapter in our journey through the world's most desolate corners. We have walked the toxic streets of Buckhorn where the very air turned a friend into a stranger. We have witnessed the silence of Milberg where an entire community vanished without a sound. We have delved into the dark heart of Snowtown where human cruelty found a home in a forgotten bank vault. These stories remind us that nowhere is not just a place on a map, but a state of being. It is the point where the safety of civilization ends and the indifference of the void begins. The Eilean Moor light still shines today, automated and indifferent to the ghosts of 1900. It stands as a sentinel of progress, yet its shadow remains cast over one of history's greatest enigmas. As we step back from these shadows, the warnings from the ruins remain clear and haunting. Do not go looking for what was meant to stay hidden in the middle of nowhere. Some secrets are better left to the wind, the dust, and the deep, cold sea. Our journey ends here, but the echoes of these forgotten places will linger in the mind. May those lost in the silence find the peace that the living still seek to understand. For in the heart of the nowhere, we often find the most profound truths about ourselves. We close the book on these mysteries, leaving them to the timeless custody of the earth. The shadows of the nowhere are long, but they are finally at rest. Thank you for walking this path with us through the dark and the desolate. Goodbye to the ghosts of Buckhorn, Milburg, Snowtown, and the Flannan Isles. Their stories are told, and the silence has returned to its rightful owners. The ocean remains the same, vast and uncaring as it was a century ago. The journey into the middle of nowhere is now complete. We leave the darkness behind and return to the light of the known world. This has been Shadows of the Nowhere. May your own path always be clear and your lights never go out. Good night, and remember to respect the silence of the abandoned. The documentary is finished. Rest now, for the mysteries have been laid to bed. This concludes our exploration of the unknown.